to the Precision Teaching Podcast. My name is Rick Cabina, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Doug Kostowitz.
Hello, everybody.
Carrie Milico.
Hi.
And Sean Datchick.
Hi, everyone.
Well, we have the crew back together, and that feels pretty good.
Definitely.
Finally.
Welcome, everyone, to the beginning of the school year. If you're a parent, I'm sure your kids are back in school by now. If you are a student or a professor or a teacher, if you're in education, you're back. We have a full show today, and we're going to start off with our segment called Happenings and Happened. We have 3 things to talk about, and the first one is to bring everyone's awareness to a very neat thing that our community does, and that is online chart shares. We have, in our show notes, there's a group of people on Facebook, and it's headed up by Ryan O'Donnell, and he gets together once a month with people through Adobe Connect. Charts are shared, people talk about them, and even if you don't have a chart to share, it would be nice for you just to go and check out what people are saying. And it's a very welcoming group, and I would like to encourage all of you to look into that and see what's going on with these online chart shares. The second item that I want to discuss is a correction. This is one of the things I love about our audience. The bigger they get, the more people are tuning in to the things that we say. And someone had a correction for me. This was probably 2 shows ago. And I said, what did I say? Applied Behavior Analysis International. This is ABAI. I don't know what was going on with me. That's certainly not correct. It's Association for Behavior Analysis International. I must have been distracted by Doug making funny faces through Skype.
Yeah, that might have been what it was. I caught that error, but I just didn't want to say anything at the time.
Sure you did.
Oh, I did.
Such an instigator.
I know.
Well, thank you for that correction. We try to be as accurate as you can, but sometimes we get caught up in the moment because we're excited about the things we're talking about. So we appreciate our audience sending us those corrections when we make them. The third thing is I'd like to thank Zach Lang, the son of Joe Lang. He was able to help engineer the sound issues that we ran into with the podcast with Joe, and he spent a lot of time editing that, and for all your help, we thank you, Zach. Let's move into our email question. Our email question says the following. In a past podcast, there was much hype about science, and although I enjoy sciencing myself, how do you or your colleagues justify advocating that society values science? That could be taken to a larger scope if you would like, and be phrased as, why should behavior analysts, precision teachers be allowed to influence people to learn about sciencing? And this question comes from Ryan in Orlando, Florida. Thank you, Ryan. This is an interesting question. Co-host, I'll let you take the first stab at this.
Can I?
Yes.
All right. Well, Ryan, as behavior analysts, we are behavior scientists, and we view and practice and align our field with other natural sciences. And this is demonstrated by our philosophies and methods. We observe, or we obviously see purpose and value in the role of science. And so as such, we are scientists advocating for society to embrace science as well. But my point, though, what I want to make with answering this question is it's Okay, so we're scientists and we can advocate for science, but it doesn't matter who you are or what you do. If you find something that you're passionate about and you want to advocate for it. I mean, hell, beauty queens advocate for world peace, and that has nothing to do with their daily activities. I feel like I was a strong advocate for natural childbirth before I even became a mother. I recently saw a documentary called How to Survive a Plague, and Netflix it if you haven't seen it. It's awesome. But there was this doctor called Dr. Iris Long. She was a chemist, and she wasn't a part of the gay community. She wasn't gay herself, but she saw at the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, like what was going on around her, and knowing all that she knew and knowing diseases and how they spread and all that good stuff, she just couldn't sit back and allow a community to be completely demolished by this epidemic. So she went to a activist group called ACT UP, and she was like, hey guys, I'm super smart in this area, and I think that you guys should really, if you want to know like the system and how science works and how research should be conducted and how clinical trials should be conducted and how the NIH and the FDA work, then let me know, and I would love to help you guys out. And she was a driving force behind all of the meds that are now being used to treat AIDS, because she educated other people who either were infected, were loved ones of those who were infected, and she educated all these people who were actors, artists, musicians. They weren't academics, and these just, residents of the East Village. And so as such, they completely changed the way that society views AIDS and how we treat those with AIDS and how we treat AIDS itself. So, I don't know, my thing is just that it doesn't matter who you are, but if you are passionate about something, you find your passion, you go with it, and you see like how your passion can play a part in society around you.
That is an excellent response.
Thanks.
I
Sorry,
feel
I'm
like
long-winded on that one.
I feel like the guy who, when Michael Jordan goes up to do the dunk and I'm like underneath the thing, I was just watching you go over my head and slam the ball down over me. We all feel strongly about science, and my take on it is we live in a civilization where I hope that we could have more citizen scientists, because our technology is not slowing down. If you look at the exponential growth in fields such as biomedicine, you look at the computer science, just almost all fields, more and more people are coming onto the planet, more and more things are being discovered. The tools that we have to make discoveries are growing. In fact, we can't even keep up with a lot of the technologies. If we wanted, we could clone a human person. Our morality is having a hard time grappling with the developments that science affords us. Therefore, I feel compelled that we should advocate for science because it has a great value, and not just that, it's going to be affecting all of our lives. And if you don't understand science, then you're going to rely upon others to make the decisions for you. I can't think of anything more critical in a technologically advanced society in being scientifically literate. I feel it's very important that all of us should continue being advocates, and although we do science, a great part of this podcast is reaching out to people and bringing news, and also hopefully shedding light on different aspects of at least the science that we all understand, which is behavior analysis, precision teaching, and how that can help influence and help people live better lives. Doug, Sean, any comments?
I think that even though, just speaking from my personal experience, I'm definitely more well-versed in the scientific literature for education interventions. However, I think that there are some skills that generalize across content areas, namely the scientific method and the power of peer review. And I think that one of the great things about learning more about the scientific method and peer review, or the review of scientific findings by your peers or colleagues, learning more about that in education has allowed me to take that critical eye and do other content areas, such as some of the other conversations that I've enjoyed taking part of on this podcast about global warming or rising of ocean tides, has allowed me to generalize some of those same skills. So I just find pleasure from learning that myself. So hopefully other people can find that same pleasure in doing that.
Well said.
Mm-hmm.
Those are very good comments. Ryan, we hope that we answered your very interesting question. We're going to move on to the next segment, which is education news. And today's highlight is Asian students carry high expectations for success. This article is one that is found in the USA Today, and it talks about how Asian students have, as the title says, has very high expectations for success. There's probably 10 different things, big points that we could talk about in this article. And one thing that's clear, the reason why these make the headlines is because our system, and this is pointed out in the article, but I say this all the time, we spend more money on education than anyone else on this planet. But yet, for that investment, we are nowhere near the top. In fact, we're about in the middle when you look at a lot of these tests. And we people want to know, what can we do to be better? And this article is getting at some of the differences between how parents put demands on kids, how the children themselves are motivated and are very highly competitive, and just the differences on how education is looked at in Asia compared to America.
What did y'all feel were some of the big takeaways on here? I know that there's one factor that really drove the narrative would be the power of culture or cultural expectations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it is interesting to compare. I've never been to Asia myself, but looking at the statistics about the gap between high-performing countries on these measures and middle of the pack or lower performing, sort of what accounts for that.
I think they allude right off the bat. They talk about the contingencies in place. And this is viewed, you can call it cultural, but there's contingencies in place for education to be viewed importantly, to have a lot of maybe of negative reinforcing and positive reinforcing contingencies that promote these kids to use education as a way to better themselves socially. So you're viewed, as you mentioned, viewed better, and it's a route for these kids. Whereas it probably doesn't hold that same. Well, obviously it doesn't hold that same across the country. That's not to say in some areas of this country it isn't viewed as important, or in some families or in some schools. But I think if you, generally speaking, it's not viewed with that same. It's not tied to the same. I can't even think of a word. It's not tied to the same the outcome. You can still better yourself in America with education, but it's not as a whole viewed as important as it is in these other countries.
Well, I think I mean I agree with both of y'all. I think the contingencies are embedded in the culture. And so as such, it is really like comparing apples to oranges. And so if you're going to read this article and be like, okay, so what now? What does this article then lead us to do? What do we advocate for as a result of this article? I think that is a little naive of us to say we have to change our society, because that's not gonna happen.
Oh no, I don't want to change
the
society.
hardest thing is to like tell. I mean, I can't tell you, being in the private sector, working with these kids who struggle in the classroom, the hardest thing to do is to change the priorities of the family and to tell them, like, I had this little girl and she's like on her way to the Olympics to be a gymnast. I mean, she is phenomenal at what she does in the gym. She's in 4th grade, but she struggles in school, to the point where it's kind of like, does she do some remedial work with school or does she do gym? And she spends about 5 hours a day in the gym, and 6 days a week. So the issue is, though, but telling her parents, hey, she's not going to be able to add if you don't spend some extra time with her on math, or you change up your priorities. Maybe, gym, we take a break from gym for 6 months. We focus in this area. That's not going to happen in their family dynamic. So I don't know if you guys looked at the stats that they were alluding to in the article, but I did. And Canada is equivalent to Japan and Singapore in all the areas of math, reading, and I believe science as well. So their culture, though, is more similar to ours. I'm not really privy on, I'm not really up to date on what cultural differences are between the U.S. and Canada, but I would say that we're more alike than Canada is to Japan. Yet they have similar academic outcomes. So obviously something is working within the culture that is similar to ours. So instead of us looking to be like, oh, we have to be tiger moms and, change our parenting styles and change the contingencies of our entire society, I wonder what Canada's doing.
One of the issues that I see in the article is, yes, this article the author is saying that culture is very different, but it's not the culture that makes the change in the child. If we look at the end of the article, they were talking about how American parents, our parental involvement isn't very good, but yet the parental involvement is very high in Japan. And then they cited how they had some kind of field day and everybody showed up. What happens when you have a society of people that value education? It's not only are they helping out their kids with homework, the real thing comes in all the extra resources they're pouring in. So the students now are studying for 2 or 3 hours as a result of this high expectation. That is the difference, because in our society, you're not going to get that.
No.
So if people just value education, that's one thing. It's what do you do when you value that education? And if you're a child, and let's say we take 2 cultures, and just on average, you study 1 hour more a night. That's 5 hours a week. That's 20 hours a month. You multiply that, if you go to 9 months, that's I can't even calculate that number.
180
Thank
hours.
you. I can't multiply 9 times 20. But thank you, Sean, for doing basic math for me. That is, think about that. If you have a group of kids that are getting 180 hours more practice and feedback, and that's a conservative estimate, who's going to do better? I mean, that's where this real issue, and they talk too about these cram schools, and they're not letting kids stay up past 10 o'clock because these kids are just focusing. The real issue when you look at, and this is true for everything, you don't get better because of what people value. You get better because of what you do with the content. The more you interact with that content. I was thinking about your story, Carrie.
Yeah.
These parents would have not Olympic gymnasts, but educational Olympians. In all of that 5 hours a day, they would be forcing their kids or encouraging their kids or whatever it looks like to be spending all that time in school, in education, in studying. So what's the outcome of that going to be?
That she's going to be a brilliant little student and
Exactly.
then advance our society by becoming brilliant at her career and whatever she chooses to do. And I think, like, there's this quote in here. It says that there is a belief that the higher education system will push the economy forward and build the talent pool. We don't think of it that way because we're an individualistic culture. Like, we think about our own, like, if we take a look at our family union, like you said, Rick, like, as parents, you know, we put education as number one priority. And I know that my family did that. But as a whole, like, as kids grow up and they're just not around their parents, they're around their teachers, their friends, any extracurricular activities that they do. And it's not about you bettering yourself for the betterment of culture, a betterment of your society. So that way that you will bring pride to your community and to your family. It's just, you got to do good in school. You know, it's not even like, this was a fifth grader even mentioned something about, if I study hard and do marks, I can go to some good schools and I'll have a good job. Like, no fifth grader that I talk to will ever talk about getting a good job because they do well in school. Like, they all have these grand goals that are about their future and about their community, and that just doesn't exist.
Yeah. The only place that I see that culturally existing in a school system would be the KIPP schools and people that follow that model, where they look and they talk to their students and they actively are always saying, hey, what college do you want to go to?
Right.
But
yeah, that's something that has to be embedded in their entire environment early on. Like, you establish that culture for that one student. And that's, like you said, like, it's the school that helps provide that as well, in addition to the parents.
There's no doubt that if our system doesn't change in some way, we're not going to change the culture unless we have another Sputnik moment. But I think those are happening, but we're just not paying attention to it.
But seriously, what is Canada doing? Canada's top 10, top 5, and like top 10 in math, top 6 in reading. Like, what, I mean, I don't think that their parenting styles are much different than American parenting styles. I mean, they've evidently found something that works in their, you know, given a similar culture and perspective of life and stuff like that. And another thing, the article did mention about, like, oh, if you go into a classroom in Asia, it's just like a classroom in America with regards to math. And I would argue that that's not the case, because in 1980, Singapore actually started using their own curriculum. They used to import curriculum, and as such have developed a completely new way to even do basic computation. Have you guys heard of Singapore math?
Yes.
I'm not super familiar with it, but I know there's a school here in Tampa that uses it, and so it's apparently just a different approach. So that was just a little side note, but I think that there's some more differences here than just what the article's alluding to.
Yes, that's one of the take home. So we know that there's a difference between the two cultures, but always look deeper into it's when you read the media, they're going to tie things up and try to give you a nice, easy, digestible piece. But with education, it's a very complex system. Many things are happening, and parents and culture are important, but there are other issues that are going on. But look out, because these students are hitting the books, spending so much time, and we live in a world where everybody's competing in the educational forum. So the take-home message is, like many of these other articles, let's take this very seriously. And, of course, we're all into something that's very powerful, which is precision teaching. And we advocate for these high-level measurement systems, practice systems. Hopefully, we can gain traction with, if not precision teaching, something else, whatever else can help our students thrive and reach their potential. Let's move on to our next segment. And the next segment, we're going to talk about, this is an educational concept discussion. And it comes from an article that says, what is learning exactly? And after reading this article, did you get the answer? Did the author give you the answer?
Not at all. Actually, I didn't think so. I don't think that she answered the question at all.
Yeah, she said nothing.
No. I felt like an undergrad could have written that. I mean, and she talked about learning approaches. And then she talked about a little bit of knowledge versus learning, which I don't think that she really dove in deep enough about that. But yeah, no, she definitely didn't answer her question.
Yeah, I found this article interesting, but unfortunately, I thought it tied together a lot of educational rhetoric that I hear regarding what does it mean to, what role does testing or assessment fit into the curriculum? And the rhetoric that I'm referring to would be this distinction that testing equals rote memorization and activities equal true learning. Which I think the truth's a lot more complicated than that. Sure, I think everybody has taken tests that they wish that they hadn't, or that they found particularly poorly constructed. However, I think that's sort of a separate issue from just painting all assessments as teaching this certain way and activity-based instruction as accomplishing a higher or more desirable outcome.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great point. The author is taking pot shots at textbooks.
Yeah.
And it's almost a straw man. And the straw man is the textbooks. And you paint the textbooks as there's all this knowledge in these textbooks, and these kids are being forced to memorize that and understand it, and that's where it starts and ends. And I'm always disturbed by these dichotomies that are created. And on the one hand, you have a curriculum in a textbook, but on the other hand, you have the generative approach or the self-discovery approach and the exploratory. If you look at the evidence is, that's not what the evidence says. There was a lot of, for example, out of Carnegie Mellon, and we talked about this on the podcast probably a couple years ago, and they looked at the difference in science between discovery learning and explicitly teaching students certain aspects of the scientific method, and how masterful are they, how do they master these concepts, and how do they generalize these concepts. And what they found is instruction beats discovery learning. We don't need to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and there is a place in the world for discovering certain things and generating hypotheses. But whenever these people come up with these dichotomies, you have to pick one or the other. So you're either in the textbook camp where the kids are just getting factual knowledge, or you're in the discovery camp where life is beautiful, there's rainbows, and everyone loves one another, and there's all these great things that are happening. There's these groups, and there's these deep conversations, and kids love it. It doesn't work that way. Maybe it works that way for some, but the way instruction works and the way learning works is there is nobody that you can find that is going to be creative and it's going to benefit from these authentic learning approaches unless they have a foundation of those facts, unless at their fingertips they're fluent in mastering all of these other parts that go into this higher level learning. I would challenge anybody to show me the person that can be creative without having the basics of whatever that thing is that they're trying to do. And that's what bothers me about these articles when they come out and when it's written to the public, and it just confuses people that don't understand about our field.
I completely agree with you.
The thing that kills me too is what is learning exactly, and we are never told what learning is. In fact, this is just this article is a way to push this author's agenda forward, and I'll tell you what learning is. This is written by Joanne Yatvin, and she is the past president of the National Council of Teachers of English. Joanne, here is what learning is, at least according to Precision Teachers. Learning is a change in performance frequencies over time. That is the most parsimonious definition you're going to get about learning ever. Think about it. We do a performance on whatever the skill is today, right now. Those performances are going to change or not change. The way they change, that's what the learning is. And of course, we measure that. We can quantify that with something called acceleration. If we want to know how fast someone's learning something, we look at those daily performance frequencies and we see how are they changing across time. If that line is steep, we can measure it and say, oh, this is a ×2. The person's weekly learning is doubling. That is where we get the science with the learning, and together we can share that explicitly and directly, and we can make quantitative and qualitative statements about that learning. So there you have it. Learning and precision teaching. That brings us to our next segment, which is our interview. This month we have another stellar guest, which is Dr. Patrick McGreevy. And let's give the interview a listen.
I would like to welcome Dr. Patrick McGreevy to the Precision Teaching Podcast. Dr. McGreevy, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
For those in our audience that don't know Pat, he has been a college professor, he's been a book author, he's been a consultant, conference and workshop organizer, an entrepreneur, and he has many, many accomplishments. Perhaps one that many of you will recognize is he is the person who started the Journal of Precision Teaching Acceleration. And when the journal started, it was just the Journal of Precision Teaching. He's written many important articles and has just been a wonderful precision teacher. Pat, I'd like to start off by asking you, how did you come to precision teaching?
Well, let's see. My first exposure to it was I went to a workshop that Ogden Leslie conducted in Denver in 1969. 1969. That's right. And then I attended several other subsequent workshops that he and others did. And then I wrote him a letter and asked him if he would consider me as a graduate student on a doctoral program. And I didn't hear from him for 9-10 months. Didn't hear any response at all. And then I can still remember the day. Then he called, and sort of out of the blue, and it was the Saturday before Easter, 1972. I still remember it. And he called, and it was on a Saturday morning, and kept me on the phone for about 2 hours and invited me to come to Lawrence to interview with him. And that's sort of how I got started.
You were a graduate student with Dr. Lindsley when did it start?
My residency, I did the doctoral residency in June of 1972 and finished it later in 1973. Then I began the work on my dissertation, which took quite some time because I had 2 grants and there was a lot of data to collect over a several-year period, and finished my dissertation in 1978.
And what was your dissertation? What was your at the time when you were working with Dr. Lindsley? What was where were you located at? What was your PhD in?
It was in education.
Okay.
Yeah, in education. Mm-hmm.
So during those times, that must have been quite an experience. I mean, you were with the great Dr. Lindsley, probably in, I don't know if it'd be safe to say that was part of the heyday of precision teaching. All of these incredible discoveries were being made, and he's going around the country all the time. That just must have been just an incredible experience.
Yeah, it was. I was just a little bit behind. In other words, I arrived as a graduate student about a year or so after some of the really substantial discoveries. I mean, I wasn't there when Eric and he finally finished the version of the chart they were happy with. That happened about a year before me. But there were still so many new things going on. I mean, a lot of people don't know that when this chart was first completed, the version that they were looking for, they were happy with, they still hadn't discovered the straight line measure acceleration. That came a year later. And
what year was that acceleration came?
It would have come in sometime in 1970, late 70, early 71, middle 71, and that was slightly before I got there. But Eric Houghton talked about the stories, Carl Koenig talked about it, and then Carl, that was the major part of Carl Koenig's dissertation in 1972, and Carl was working on his dissertation when I arrived as a graduate student in 1972.
Oh, that's just an amazing.
I mean, I remember hearing the stories when Eric would, and there's other people that can report these stories as well, like Clay Starlin and other people like that can report the same stories. But and Clay Starlin was actually there right around that time when this actually happened. But that apparently Eric came running out of his office one day and was yelling pretty loudly that he had figured out a way to get all of human behavior on a single 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And when they did that, of course, they had to make it logarithmic to do it. And when they did, they were still a year from realizing that would mean that you could project in straight lines as well. They were a year from discovering that. A lot of people don't know that. So when I got to Kansas City in 1972, acceleration as a straight line measure was in its infancy. It was just beginning to occur, which was pretty exciting.
The time that you were there, you must have. Again, as you're talking, I'm just imagining what it would be like during that time. With Og being in such demand, what kind of mentor was he as your chair of your committee?
Well, I was going a great deal in consulting, and I was convinced, there's sort of a two-part answer to that, and I was convinced that I needed to spend more time with him. So I approached him, and I said, could you take me along on some of these consultation trips? I don't want any money out of it, but I just want to be there with you, and I want to learn from you as you're doing this, because you're out there talking with people about individual people and individual classrooms, individual settings, and that's where I think I can really learn from you. And so he then started taking me along on these visits. Otherwise, he'd be gone for several weeks at a time, and other than class, I wouldn't see too much of it. And so I kind of pushed that issue, and that worked really well. As far as the committee was, Og took care of that beautifully. There was never any doubt about that. He helped me select the committee. And pretty much guided the committee process, and I didn't really have any great worries about the committee process at all.
When you went to these gatherings, were they the legendary short courses that he was teaching?
Oh yes, my first short course was the first year. Right after I got there, I went to a short course right away. That was one of the first things I did in June of '72, is go to one of the short courses, and then went to several after that. And Steve Graff was at the first short course that I went to as well. I distinctly remember that. And we were at the same short course, 1972. That's where I met him. And and then there were, there were all sorts of other, events going on as well.
What was a short course like?
Well, the short course was a 2-day event, and what you did is, it was just a series of speakers. Og, of course, was a speaker, and Eric Houghton was a speaker, and Diana Dean was a speaker, and let's see who else. At least those three, if not. Oh, and Henry Sokolov was, and there were several. Oh, Carl Koenig did a piece, and so everybody would do little 1-hour segments of various topics, so forth, and it would go through, and then that's pretty much what it would be. And there was a lot of audience participation. There was a lot of question and answer sessions in between, lots of social interaction between sessions, after sessions. They were really long days, but you felt like you were quite energized, and so it didn't so long day. But when you looked up, it was 7 o'clock at night, and you'd been there since 8 in the morning, and it hadn't seemed like a very long day at all.
Back in the 70s, precision teaching became very popular. It was used across the United States. There were whole states that were adopting precision teaching. What do you see what was different then about now? We're certainly not in the same in terms of popularity and usage. We can't compare to the 70s, but what was different then and now?
Well, where it started, where it began to flourish, is the result of several. There was 2 or 3 pretty substantial federal grants that were funded through the states, and that's how stuff got started in Montana and various other places, and then other individual schools would take on precision teaching. In Montana, it was an entire school district, and then there were various people like Owen White and Tom Lovett and people like that who were in various universities, and they started regular courses where they standard charting and precision teaching to the university students. So we had a number of people coming out with that experience and that background, and that's kind of how it was in those days. And then, we still had regular graduate students coming out of Kansas, and then people like Julie Vargas began to turn out graduate students who had charting background, and various other folks.
Mm-hmm. The capacity certainly has shifted now, whereas we don't have as many professors doing precision teaching, though they're still out there, just perhaps not on the same scale.
Yeah, I would say that's probably true. There's fewer of them, and there's like hotspots, so to speak, of standard charting and precision teaching in the States and outside the States as well, but there probably aren't as many as there were at one time.
Mm-hmm.
Not from my observation, anyway. We lost Owen White just recently, and I don't know that there's anybody at the University of Washington that teaches it anymore. Maybe there is, but there was not only Owen White, there was Tom Lovett, Felix Billingsley. There were a number of different people at the University of Washington that taught it, and I don't know whether there's anybody left that does. There might be, but I'm not aware of who it is. I don't know. Maybe Kent does some consultant teaching over there. I don't know. I'm not sure.
And you, in 1980, you started the Journal of Precision Teaching. How did that happen?
Well, basically how it happened was there were, I don't know how many of us, were trying to publish our work elsewhere, and it wasn't happening. Like, I sent 2 particular manuscripts to the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and they wouldn't review either one. They wouldn't even send them out for review. And the 2 reasons given were that they didn't include measures of inter-observer agreement, which we were thoroughly and completely opposed to, and still are. And they were not, and they were on the standard chart. So they not only not only weren't rejected, they weren't even sent out. The journal editor wouldn't even send them out for review. And this became quite frustrating. One in particular that I sent to JABA, they just turned around and sent it right back. And I sent it to Developmental Medicine and Child Neurology, a British medical journal, and 4 months later they published it with the standard chart. And the fact that it didn't have inter-observer agreement, which they thought was a silly notion to begin with, and they in fact complimented the chart, saying it was easy to read and was quite a clear description of the behavior in question. So many of us were frustrated by this whole situation, and so a number of us talked about it, and so we finally just said literally with about $250 or $300 in our pocket to spend, we started it. Literally, that's what it was. And the first issue we published, I think, maybe 250 or 300 copies, maybe. But it certainly wasn't any more than that. And we just decided that we would give it a shot and see what happened. And because and Eric published something in the very first issue, and some other folks as well, and got us started, and that's sort of what drove it anyway from the beginning.
And the journal has continued through the years. Many of the people that I can think of in precision teaching have published remarkable things. Ogden Lindsley himself has written articles in the journal.
Yes, he did. And yes, Og and Eric, Carl Binder, just to name a few, and others as well. And these are articles in the very early days of it, and everybody was real supportive of it. I was real pleased about that. And then several people would, probably people who would rather go unnamed, would just send money every so often. So I think maybe our subscription fee might have been I don't know, $30 or $40. I don't remember what it was, but it wasn't very much. And we didn't have much money. In fact, most of the time we didn't have enough money to pay for the printing. And but every so often I would get a check from several people who, as I say, would rather, I think, probably go unnamed, but they would just send me money, and there'd be $100 or $200 or something in there, and it would say, keep the journal going, and it would be from one of those folks. And that's what helped us keep going, because we really didn't have enough money, literally most of the time, to pay the printing bill.
You bring up some very interesting questions and thoughts. Many journals start exactly the way that you are saying. For example, a lot of people may not know this, but the Journal of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior was a reaction from people not wanting to publish Skinnerian types of behavior analysis, working with pigeons. So,
and single subject design. Single subject design in those days was very controversial. And,
yeah.
As a single subject design, people didn't want to take that. And Og was on the development committee for JAB and Java both, and he would tell us many stories about that. But yeah, it was no statistics, single subject, and then in addition to that, a lot of it was based on Skinner's work, and so on all three accounts, there wasn't a vast array of journals willing to take the articles. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to think about when we approach how do we do science. You brought up an interesting point, and that is IOA. For those of you that might not be familiar with that term, that stands for Inter-Observer Agreement. And Inter-Observer Agreement, all that means is that when you do science, you have to make sure that your dependent variable, or this thing that you're measuring, is done with integrity. And all IOA means is that one person observed the score, another person observed the score, and then they compare, hey, do we match up? That tells you nothing in regards to, do you actually have an accurate measure? All it tells you is, did these two people agree? And as Johnson and Pennypacker, and they pointed out for years, that is believability. In other words, it gets at, can you convince people that these data are good enough for interpretation? And that's something that unfortunately still persists to today. And I don't know what the answer is to that, because it seems that there are other practices too that also persist. There certainly are people biased against the chart. Some people might not understand it. Some people may actually have an active bias against it. But in your long career, what do you see as happening for the future of science, and especially the practice of precision teaching?
Well, this obsession that applied behavior analysis has had with inter-observer agreement, as you say, has persisted. And it's interesting because most other areas of science don't even acknowledge such a procedure or even a similar procedure. They simply let what is commonly referred to as external validity take care of the situation. So if somebody publishes something and it may seem questionable, what people do is they try to replicate it. And if they replicate it, that's where the term external validity comes in. That means that external validity has been established. Someone was able to replicate it, whether it's direct systematic replication. That's the way science generally takes care of things. And yet in applied behavior analysis, we do occasionally, publish replications, but not very frequently. And we seem on one with this notion of inter-observer agreement. But anyway, I think that I'm not. There's a lot of things today in other areas that are purported to be science, but when you look close at it, there isn't much science to it at all. some of the basic tenets of science. If you read some of the philosophers of science, they're just not there. And some of the things that, I mean, people purport to be something to be a result of science when it's not falsifiable, when the hypothesis isn't falsifiable. There's no way to falsify it. And if you don't have falsifiability, you don't have science. And that's a common practice today. And so many of us, I think that if applied behavior analysis would get back to the basics of science and pay attention to that more than anything else, and not some of this other kind of stuff. Science also has standard measurement, and that's what Ogg was trying to do. I think the primary reason why most people don't look at the standard chart or don't even acknowledge it is because there is a history, and it's been passed down through several generations of this funny-looking, odd-looking instrument isn't even worth considering. And I think most people who have brushed it aside don't even understand it, don't even understand what the basic premise is, what Ogg was trying to do, they can't even give you two good arguments against the chart. Well, why? And they'll brush you off with some sort of comment about, it's difficult to look at and it's hard to use. Well, okay, I'll grant you it's difficult to look at in the first 2 or 3 days. It's not hard to use at all. And it's just people who have never tried to get into it.
That is, unfortunately, many experiences that people who are in precision teaching have. I think it's important to point out that when you meet people in precision teaching, it's generally a group of people that aren't looking for a clash or a quarrel with someone, but rather we have this technology, and because, like applied behavior analysis, people who are in the game of behavior analysis are in it because, by and large, they want to help people. They have this, like medicine, you have this technology that's geared for helping people, and what we see is that, hey, look, you can do your job better if you adopt a higher level of science. And that's what's so frustrating, and I think that's an important message to get out. It's not like, hey, look, we want to do these things because it's our thing, and it doesn't have anything to do with that. We actually have science on our side. If you use standard measurement, that's better than non-standard measurement. That's factually true. If you have falsifiability, that is going to lead to a rigorous account of whatever the phenomenon you're studying. And all of that, I think, I hear that when you're talking, and that's a point I think people should understand about precision teaching and why these issues such as why does IOA persist and why are we using these non-standard charts, why those things really are problems for our field.
Ogg used to boil it down to a single sentence. If your measurement or your graph or your display, either your units or your display, are not standard, okay, then they're not constant. And the opposite of constant is what? It's a variable. Your unit of measurement and particularly your display are a variable. That cuts right at the heart of science. That cuts it right there. I mean, if your measures and your display are up to you and they're not standard, then you've cut into the basic notion of science. You can display the data kind of any way you want, and that's acceptable. Then you've cut right at the heart of science.
We should probably take a minute to let that very notion sink in to people who are listening. If your measures are a variable, that is a very striking comment to think about.
Oh, I remember when Ogg said it for the first time, I was just stunned. I remember standing back and just saying, I'm going to digest that myself for a while because that's pretty powerful. And I think I think if a lot of people were, were willing to give it some time and think about it. Now, these are people that have historically been opposed to it. Then I think that, they might give it another thought. Now, like you said, though, when you approach people initially about precision teaching, you don't often get that kind of reaction. They're looking for something to help their work, and you don't have this kind of, oftentimes, this sort of negativity toward the chart.
Let's fast forward to today. What are you doing now with your time? You have a new series. You are conducting workshops. You are presenting at conferences. You're very active. What is Dr. Pat McGreevy doing now?
Well, mostly just that sort of thing. We've recently published our curriculum and assessment for individuals with moderate to severe disabilities called Essential for Living. And I've been involved since it was published last October, been involved in a lot of the training workshops, promotions for the book itself. The book, of course, has several standard charts in it. We have a problem behavior section, and particularly we use the chart both in terms of fluency and in terms of achieving fluency on certain skills and measuring problem behavior. And so I've been spending a good deal of my time doing that. I still consult with several agencies and working with various levels of skill development. And then I still teach a little bit at Florida Institute of Technology. We're very proud that at FIT we keep standard charting and precision teaching alive and well. And my colleague Ed Blakely uses it in his class, and I teach a seminar in precision teaching. I also teach a separate seminar in standard acceleration charting. And in both of our classes, we do fluency timings with the students. And in the very first exam that Dr. Blakely gives to his new students in behavior analysis, ABA 101, the first several exams, they have to sit down with him head-to-head, one-to-one, and he gives them questions, and they have to fire back the answers, and it is all timed. And you have to reach a certain criterion fluency criterion in order to pass the exam. So we keep things alive and well, and all the responses are interverbal. There's no multiple choice. If you take a course in our campus in Orlando, you will never encounter anything that's multiple choice. They will all be pure interverbals, and they will all be like fill in the blanks, answers, short answers, all that sort of thing. So I'm doing that, and that keeps me more than occupied.
Your book, Essential for Living, your curriculum, where did you draw the inspiration for that?
Well, there were two things. First off, somewhat in the middle of my career, I became more aware of Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior, and had a couple of rather lengthy conversations with Og about it, and because we had not had it in our curriculum at all at Kansas. And so I spent a lot of time with Jack Michael and got myself immersed in verbal behavior and realized that we've been missing a major point, and that is that we get a number of adults with developmental disabilities reach adulthood, and they not only don't have a manned or a requesting repertoire, they don't even have a way to function as a speaker. In other words, they're maybe limited in their vocal or no vocal skills, and they have no alternative method. So I got heavily involved in that. And then most of the work in verbal behavior at the time was geared toward little kids with autism. And I saw, of course, and many others, of course, saw as well, that there was a great need with older kids and adults way outside the autism community. So we put together this, and originally we entitled, our working title was Language for Living. So we were going to teach verbal behavior or language to older kids and adults with severe disabilities, and focus on functional language skills rather than cute little developmental skills for little 3 and 4-year-olds. Well, at the same time, this leftover emphasis on academic skills from No Child Left Behind, many states were developing these alternative assessments, alternative to the state achievement tests for individuals with severe disabilities, and they were still very academically oriented, and most of the skills in the assessment instrument weren't functional or useful for the kids at all. So we expanded our work midway through the project. About 2.5 to 3 years into the project, our working title changed from Language for a Living to Essential for Living. And so we now included not only the language skills, but daily living, tolerating a whole, other things. And a whole, array of other things became part of the project itself.
I forgot to mention that, so your book, Essential for Living, is very significant in that it's well written, it has standard charts in it, and it serves a need, a systematic need. But the other book that I forgot that you're very famous for writing is your Teaching and Learning in Plain English. And that is something that is, I don't know if it, there's been the chart book that was out there, but your book may have been one of the first books explaining precision teaching. Is that accurate?
I don't think it would be the first. In fact, I'm sure it's not the first. There was a book that Harold Kunzelman put out, and
oh, that's right.
And it was a book, a precision teaching book, a little paperback. It was quite good, very, very technically accurate and everything.
Yeah.
And then there was the handbook of the chart, but that was just the mechanics of charting, which was fine. But so I think it was the only other book at the time other than Harold's book. And what I was trying to do is just put the basics in very simple format, not sort of overwhelm people with technicalities. But there was a whole chapter on how to chart, and there was a different page for each step, like how you found the floor, how you dropped the dots, da-da-da-da. And then there was room in the book for you to practice it yourself. And then, and that came out, in 1980. And then we did a second printing in 83. And then it just sort of faded, if you will, for lack of sales were down this. So then, I don't remember the exact time frame. I want to say maybe around 1993 or 4, something like that. Steve Eversole, who runs Behavior Development Solutions on the web, he came to me, and there was still a requirement in the certification, behavior analysis certification exam, they still had a few questions about the chart. So I gave him the right he made copies of it, essentially copies of the original manuscript. And then he sold it through Behavior Development Solutions, and in fact, he still does. And but it's a bound photocopy of the original manuscript.
Well, Pat, we are approaching the end of our interview. Is there anything that I should have asked you that didn't, or anything you would like to share with the audience?
Well, I think, Rick, one of the most important things for me is that I want to see the precision teaching community stay alive and stay active. And if we don't grow in number, we keep it going and we keep it alive and keep the notion of standard measurement and fluency alive and well, because I think that, and we shouldn't be discouraged that our numbers are small sometimes. But what we should strive to do with all of our energy is to keep an active community alive, so that at some point when we can insert ourselves into various projects and become even more useful and more influential than we are, we're there to do it, so that when someday the door is open, we can jump in, we can be there, and we have an active community that's ready to go, that's ready to make a substantial impact. I mean, it's so easy to see the potential for fluency. Goodness sake, it's right out there. I mean, all the kids that can do stuff at these ridiculous performance criteria of 80% and all this nonsense. I mean, we can beat that any day of the week without even looking. It's easy. And we know how to do it, and we're ready to do it. And if somebody's willing to listen and is interested and we can get them to listen, we're ready to go. And so I just would encourage people that don't be discouraged if there aren't, if you don't have a lot of colleagues doing it. You stay alive and you stay part of the community and you stay active and you hang out around other precision teachers to keep you energized so we can keep the effort moving.
That is a wonderful comment. Pat, you have been a guiding light in precision teaching, and your career demonstrates a commitment to science and a commitment to helping people. And I'm honored that you've taken time out of your busy day to speak to us at the Precision Teaching Podcast.
Well, thanks for having me, Rick. I appreciate it very much.
Well, that, as I said earlier, was a very informative and fabulous interview. Dr. McGreevy, one of the great people in precision teaching, has many students, many people he's helped, and it was just wonderful listening to Pat talk about precision teaching. Well, we're towards the end of another podcast. Any closing comments from the podcast crew?
If you write an article that has a question in the title, make sure you answer that question in your article.
Excellent comment.
Thanks.
Well, on behalf of Doug Kostowitz, Carrie Milico, and Sean Datchick, I am Rick Cabina, and thank you for listening to the Precision Teaching Podcast.